Hey, and welcome to ALEKS Listens. My name's Alex. This is the place where I talk about things like philosophy and politics and identity and psychology and that kind of stuff, and what they mean for us in this confusing and overwhelming world. So I have a podcast which is called ALEKS Listens, evidently, and this is the video component for that podcast. If you haven't heard of the podcast, I'm not surprised. If you haven't listened to it but you'd like to, you can listen in a number of places. You can listen on Spotify, on iTunes, wherever, really. I also have a website, www.aleks.co, and all of my podcasts are on there, as well as some things that I've written, and some information about me if you're interested in me, if anyone's interested in me. So briefly, before I begin, if you're enjoying the podcast, if you're enjoying these videos, like, subscribe, do whatever all of the phonies on YouTube tell you to do. Not that I'm aligning myself with the phonies, but, I guess that's how it works. Also, you can support the podcast on Patreon. You can support these videos on Patreon, and there'll be a link below. Cool. Okay, so today I'm talking about, I'm going to try and answer a question. And that question is existentialism a waste of time? And there are a number of reasons why I figured that this was a question that I wanted to ask. I guess principally, the reasons are very personal. I am someone who is very sensitive and susceptible to feelings of existential dread and kind of existential loneliness and existential isolation and existential angst. And so these are things that I've thought about for a long time. What does it mean to be anyone? What does it mean to be me? What does it mean to be you? I probably haven't thought about you so much. Sorry. But, I guess it seems like everyone kind of asks themselves these questions. Questions of belonging, questions of meaning, questions of priorities, questions of interest, questions of disinterest. And I guess for a number of years, mainly between the ages of 16 and 22, I was really deeply considering these things. And I brooded a lot, and I was kind of trapped in the past, trying to trace kind of causal pathways between previous or past behavior and past interests and the person I was or the person I am today. And I study philosophy. And in my studies, I have tried to kind of draw pragmatic and practical lessons out of the abstract and out of the theoretical. And one of the areas of philosophy which has been most interesting to me and which has been most influential has been existentialism. So I guess that's why I wanted to share with you some of my thoughts about what it is and why we should or shouldn't care about it, and why we should or shouldn't actually try and consciously direct our mental energy towards thinking about that kind of stuff. So, as usual, I have very little guidance. I have 6 things written in my notebook, 6 kind of headings, and I guess I'm going to work through them chronologically because I don't know. I mean, they're kind of arbitrarily. No, they're not. They're not arbitrary. What am I talking about? I actually, I thought about how I wanted to structure this. So they're not arbitrarily structured. They're intentionally structured in the way they are because I think that, there is an important order to follow when talking about this kind of stuff. So firstly, I'm going to try and provide you with a working definition of existentialism. So question 1, what is existentialism? crudely, existentialism is the investigation of what it means to be. And you can look at that question through so many different lenses that it kind of begins to hurt. But I guess one of the main lenses that 20th century it seems like existentialism really kicked off after the Second World War, or around about that time. France and Germany were two of the kind of leading countries. People like Simone de Beauvoir, Martin Heidegger, people who I've mentioned a number of times in this podcast. And I guess they were, you can think about the geopolitical and cultural context within which they were thinking and writing. And so, they were responding to or influenced by one of the greatest tragedies, and one of the greatest tragedies of our time, of what it means to be of one of the greatest tragedies of humankind. And I'm sure that influenced their thinking. But, something that I am personally attached to, and I guess biologically attached to, is the Algerian War for Independence. And France was a colonial power, and it colonized Algeria for a long time, 100 and something years, 50 plus. And they fought a very bloody and gruesome war of independence in the 1960s, and gained independence in 63, sorry. And that also was a big thing that featured in French politics and French discussions of freedom and equality and privilege and power and purpose. And so I guess the existential question is, as I said before, what does it mean to be? And it's very difficult to actually... It's very difficult to do... It's very difficult to know what to do with that question, because it seems like being is something subjective, and something that only I and you can know about. I don't know what it's like for you to be. I guess I can guess. It probably feels like what it's like for me to be. But really, I only have insight into my consciousness. You can kind of talk to me and tell me what you experience, but I'm sure a lot of the kind of raw experience of things is lost in language. But some other things are gained, and this isn't a critique of language. This is just what I'm trying to articulate is the difficulty that we have sharing experience. And the reason why I've kind of talked about or kind of moved this in the direction of subjectivity is because, well, the second heading I have is the problem of subjectivity and self-authoring. So I guess maybe you feel like I didn't provide a satisfactory definition of what existentialism is, but that's because I don't really feel like there is one, and I don't feel like it's actually important for me to give you something apart from what I said, which is, what does it mean to be? And I guess, from existentialism, that word, there is, a clear link to existence. And what does it mean to exist? Is there a directionality to our existence? Is there a temporality to our existence? Is there an intelligibility to our existence? Is there a univocity to our existence? Is our existence shared? Is it subjectively experienced? Is it objectively experienced? I'm getting a bit sidetracked, but I got to the point of saying that I don't know what it's like for you to be, but I have an idea of what it's like for you to be. And I guess, in my eyes, there is something very strange about the existential project in the 20th century. And what is strange is that there seem to be two objectives that are kind of permanently in tension with one another. And I think I have managed to reconcile the tension between these two objectives. And I believe that the tension has actually been overcome and can be overcome if you consider it through a particular light. So I guess the tension is that on one hand, the existential project is a fundamentally personal project. As I said, it is a project of what it means for me to be. And what it means for me to be primarily has meaning for me. There is something that it means for me to be me. And there is importance for me in the directionality of my life and in the things that I decide to do or the things that I decide not to do with my time. But on the other hand, there is a kind of wider socio-cultural, historic, political context within which I fit. And Heidegger called this facticity. So facticity refers to kind of the sum total of inputs of my world, which I don't have any control over, but I am born into. So I was born in France. I was raised in Melbourne. I have parents who are migrants. I have friends from all over the world. I went to particular schools. And I didn't have control over, I guess there are some things that I have control over, like who I choose to be friends with. I have, more control than I do over that than I do over who my parents are. I have no control, absolutely no control over that. I have no control over the point in history in which I am born. That is not a decision for me to make. So I guess the facticity refers to the information which informs us that we don't have subjective control or conscious control over. And so I was trying to distinguish between two objectives. So initially I said that that existentialism was a fundamentally personal project. What does it mean for me to be? What should I care about? How much control have I had over choosing what I have cared about? And then there is the second objective, which is a wider socio-political, historical objective. Are there things which are shared between conscious, sentient life, such as human life? Are there things which are shared which also ought to be protected? So some people might say religion is something which is shared and ought to be protected. Some people might say avocados are shared and ought to be protected. Depending on where you live in Melbourne or where you live in the world, there are varying needs and varying levels of attraction towards avocados and also towards religion. And then there are kind of if you kind of conduct some meta-analysis of what it means to have access to an avocado, and this is a pretty silly way of kind of making this point, but I guess it stands. There is a really complex set of structures which allow you to actually get the avocado, right? So you have the supermarket or the grocery store or the place where you buy the avocado from. And then you have power relations between producer and consumer. You need to have, a currency to exchange. You pay for someone's labor. There is some kind of cultural attachment to money. There are all of these things which dictate our capacity to actually consume, right? And I guess there are principles which, if you kind of do what I was doing, right, which was trying to deconstruct the pathways that we probably don't really pay much attention to when we are thinking about things like buying an avocado. There are kind of key principles which uphold our capacity to do such things. There is a kind of political freedom, right? There is an autonomy. I have preferences. I like avocados. I have money. I want to use and wield all of these things together and at the same time, and I want to buy an avocado. I'm probably not very aware of it, but I am exercising an immense number of different privileges, and I am kind of living through an immense number of principles. The principle of freedom, the principle of autonomy, the principle of respect for others, the principle of respect for myself, because, there's some kind of hedonism to this, but I have certain preferences, and those which can be reasonably realized, I pursue. Buying an avocado isn't fatal. I guess, there are actually, some pretty severe environmental consequences to avocado farming, especially in California. I remember talking to this guy in Spain about that, who worked on an avocado farm, and he was telling me about the volume of water that they used, and like for each avocado. And but the environmental ethics aside, there's so much to such a simple transaction, and I guess, Simone de Beauvoir, if you went back to the 60s and you sat down and had a conversation and spoke with her, she probably wouldn't tell you that, the reason why she was thinking about this kind of stuff was because she wanted people to be able to buy avocados, right? The care is much more profound than that. The care is much more important than that. The care is that there are things that must be protected for all of us to actually be able to be subjectively experiencing agents with freedom. And I guess that last thing I said, with freedom, I said that because that is one of the, if not the central component of existential philosophy. Intellectual freedom, political freedom, ideological freedom, physical freedom, emotional freedom, financial freedom, social freedom, all of these kinds of, like, again, I return to the stupid example of the avocado, but really, like, maybe it's actually like, maybe we need to think about things as simple as a transaction like that in order to realize how much we are actually taking for granted, and how much of the existential project we are actually either contributing to or undermining when we live. So I guess the three existential philosophers who I am most comfortable with are Simone de Beauvoir, Martin Heidegger, Albert Camus, the author of The Stranger, and that was four. Jean-Paul Sartre. But I guess for them, not so much Camus, but for the other three, there is some freedom. Freedom appears to be the central, or one of the central components of being, right? And that is because we are these agents, or we are these bodies, or we are these minds, or we are these spirits, or whatever you want to call us. But we are these things that engage with the world, right? And our engagement with the world is subject to power relations, and to positionality, and to politics, and to financial and economic capacity, and to all of these kinds of things, right? But one thing which seems to really expand your kind of experiential horizon is freedom. Because if you are free, you can go wherever you like with your life. And so the link to existentialism here is, like, I guess in some sense it's subtle, but in some other sense it should be patently obvious, right? Because when I say, what does it mean for me to be? Built into that sentence is being. And I guess the existential philosophers, and when we ask the question of, is existentialism a waste of time? If we say yes to that question, that it is a waste of time, what we're essentially saying is that the investigation of things which can emancipate people is a waste of time. And I guess, maybe you can kind of do some other things. Like maybe you can like get into some kind of practical ethics, and, get into some really kind of tangible political action. But I guess, like, what drives you to do that, right? I think you'd have a pretty hard, at least people, like, I don't know, concepts and like ideas, and I don't even know what to call freedom. Like, what even is that? Like, is it an idea? Like, ideal? Maybe it's an ideal. Ideals like freedom are so, they have to be omnipresent, right? They have to be everywhere. I don't see how freedom isn't linked to every single thing ever. And I guess in that sense, the existential philosophers aren't moral, or most of them, the ones who believe that freedom is the central component of what it means to be, those people aren't moral relativists. And I guess moral relativism is, the claim that morality is subjective to the individual, right? So I believe that harming others is bad. You believe that harming others is good. I say, hey, what are you talking about? And you say, hey, what on what basis do you say that harm is bad? And then I appeal to something. I say harm is bad because, I shouldn't subject others to suffering. I shouldn't make others suffer. And then you say, oh, well, you kind of do the same thing that you did with the avocado transaction. You kind of keep asking questions. What does it mean for someone else to suffer? And I say, I don't know, it feels bad. What does it mean to feel? I don't know, there's some kind of interplay between the mind and the body. Oh, what does it mean to have a mind or a body? And then eventually, I guess the people who are moral relativists, I don't think I've met anyone who's a moral relativist who really believes that morality is totally subjective. The existentialists weren't that. Many of them believed that, well, especially the three, let's leave Camus aside because his nihilism and absurdism is kind of confusing, but those three believed that freedom is, I guess Heidegger you have to be careful with because of his involvement in Nazism. But I guess so let's remove him from the list as well. Simone de Beauvoir, and actually let's just go Jean-Paul Sartre because he's the one whose discussion of freedom I am most comfortable with. I guess Heidegger's authenticity also, but he believed that we have this immensely radical freedom, right? And that is central to all experience. That is the central component of what it means to be, because any kind of restriction or limitation placed on my freedom undermines my capacity for self-expression, for self-authoring, for actually being, right? And I guess I have spent all of my life in a Western context, and I guess the Western world in Australia in 2020 is a place which prioritizes the individual and individualism. And so I guess, and most of my listeners are from Western countries: Australia, UK, USA, France, Germany, some in Scandinavian countries, New Zealand. These are all countries that rest upon the neoliberal model and the capitalist framework, which prioritize the freedom of, I guess neoliberalism neoliberalism specifically prioritizes a certain kind of freedom, a freedom from tax and a freedom from kind of, government guidance, and a freedom to commodify whatever you want. And so I guess I'm not arguing for neoliberalism because I do not want unregulated business. I am not for people not paying taxes. But, we should be familiar with the existential question of freedom. But I guess in the Western world, we've been presented with that not through the lens of philosophy, but through the lens of productivity and of power and of money and gain, accruing capital. But when you disassemble in a very basic way, when you kind of dismantle neoliberalism, essentially what it is a very specific interpretation of what it means to be free. And I guess my point here is that we live in that you can't think that existentialism is a waste of time, because that isn't the world that you live in. The world that you live in is a world driven by existential questions. Why do you have the particular political leaning that you do? It's because there are certain priorities that you believe are intrinsic to the question of being. I guess, the progressives, the social and economic progressives, want or, people on the left, some people on the left want a welfare state. They want the government to, and, this is very relevant now more than, I guess it has been in the past few years during a pandemic, when people don't have access to the same kind of modes of money generation as they once did. So people turn to the government. People want to turn to the government for support. Why? Why do they want support? Because there are certain freedoms. I guess looking at this through the lens of freedom, there are certain freedoms which can only be accessed with access to the vehicles which drive the system. Money is one of the core, if not the core vehicle which drives the Australian economy. Obviously there's labour, there are ideas, there is motivation, there are bodies, there's politics, there are all of these different things. But, freedom is an inescapable facet of being alive. And you either have it or you don't. Or you're somewhere in the middle where, it's limited in some respects and you have more of it in others. So, okay, that was a pretty intense tangent, but I'm still on the second question. The second question is, the second thing that I was going to talk about was the problem of subjectivity. And I guess I spoke a lot about the second thing. So the first thing was there is the individual who needs to be free. But then there is the individual within a particular facticity, within a particular set of circumstances. And in order for the first thing to actually happen, for the individual to be free, there needs to be a kind of a set of social structures which facilitate that freedom. Politics, economics, power relations, ways we think about race, ways we think about gender, ways we think about equality. All of these things inform the individual, but at the same time, the individual also informs these things. Okay, so I guess I said before that there seems to be a tension, right? There's a tension between the individual and between the kind of bigger macro structure which informs the individual, which is comprised of politics and whatever. But both, they inform each other and they kind of mold and sculpt each other. And if you take one away, presumably you don't have the other. I guess one question that you can think about to see whether you actually agree with that claim that I made, that if you take one away, you don't have the other, is if you take away the consciously experiencing agent, us, if you take us away, if you take me away, and if you take you away, is there anything at all? Yes, presumably. If you take humans away, there's still the world. There's still life, right? But if you take away a conscious experiencing, or the most complex conscious experiencing agent that we have discovered yet, us, you take away a means of engaging and understanding the world, and you just have the world in its purest form. So, I don't know, I guess to turn that into a question, like, obviously you can't have, like, there is no existential question, really, if there isn't a human being, or if there isn't a complex, sentient, conscious agent. If we were just robots who didn't feel anything, if there was no meaning attached to the world, presumably there wouldn't be a question of what it meant to be, or that question would be very simple, because it would be determined by an algorithm. So you could actually answer that question. But yes, we're not determined by algorithms. We have to author our own meaning. And this is why the existential question is so important. And I've been pretty damn vague up until now about how to actually implement the existential question of what it means to be, how to actually consider that in the context of your own life. So I guess that's why the third point that I wanted to talk about was an example of an unfortunate way of being. Okay, my mouth is dry. I'm going to drink some tea. Oh. Okay, so there's this guy, right? A French existentialist philosopher, and he had this idea called bad faith. Jean-Paul Sartre is his name, and he kind of, I guess my understanding of bad faith and what it is a way of thinking about how not to be, or about how to think about the kinds of behavior that we might actually be doing which undermine or limit our freedom. And I guess hopefully I have given you enough of a push to actually agree with me that freedom is something which is fundamental to the human experience. If you don't agree with me, leave a comment on YouTube or message me, because I'd like to hear what you think. But I mean, I'm actually not familiar with an argument against the idea that freedom is an intrinsic part of the human condition, unless, you're a really hardline determinist and you believe that there is no such thing as freedom because everything has been decided by, I don't know, a god or a computer, or we're living in a simulation. But I mean, I think that's pretty bullshit. So, okay. So bad faith. So consider the gambler. Consider a gambler. A problem gambler. Problemed, whatever. Someone who has a severe addiction to gambling. Now that person there are two ways that person could be acting in bad faith. One way is that they may reject their facticity, right? And remember what the facticity is. So the facticity is the sum of their kind of socio-cultural, historical circumstance. All of the things that were outside of their control that they were born into, which have informed them. The way they've been socialized, the politics of their time, the politics of their parents, the politics of their community, their education, their interests, their preferences, whatever. Right? So the gambler will be in bad faith, will be acting in bad faith if they believe that they are free from their facticity. The gambler will be in bad faith if they believe that they are their facticity, right? So if I reflect, let's suppose that I am this gambler, and I reflect on the past 10 years, and I say, every day I have gambled, and I am a gambler. That's all I've ever been, and that's all I will be. I have no power to change that. I am not free to change that. Now that might seem obvious why that is a way of thinking that we should not want for ourselves. Because it's not true. It's not true. While we are influenced by our facticity, we are not our facticity in the future. And I believe that all of us possess the ability to navigate the world, or to have a degree of power over the way in which we navigate the world. So the gambler is in bad faith if they believe that they in fact don't have that power, but that their behavior has already been decided by the person who they once were, or who they have been until this point. So you're right. I guess essentially the claim is that you can't believe, or you really shouldn't believe, that who you have been is who you will always be. Because I guess you can see in the context of existentialism, it's a really wicked thing to believe for yourself. It's a really kind of anti-conscious thing to believe. Because as a conscious agent, you have control, or a certain degree of control over your navigation of the world, which is independent from the past. Obviously, so much of what your preferences are, what your interests are, what your behavior is going to be, if not totally determined, then very heavily influenced by your past. But here's an example. Here's an insight into my personal life. Not a very interesting one, but I have always struggled to wake up early, and for a long time I was like, I don't know, I'm just a sleepy dude. And then 2 months ago I was like, I'm going to change. I'm going to wake up at 5 a.m. And I guess for 2 months I've been mostly sticking to that. Sometimes I wake up later, but mostly around 5, between 5 and 6. And so I would have been in there. I can see how I may have just continued down the path of thinking that I'm just a sleepy person and that I just need more sleep. Or that I just need to sleep in or whatever. But, I didn't want to accept that. And so I pushed myself. And it worked. Okay, so that's the first way that we can be in bad faith, by believing that we are what we have been. We are what we were born into. Now, I guess the second one I can articulate, or I can explain in a much more simple way, because I've already given you the first example of thinking that you are defined by your past, your facticity. The second way in which we are in bad faith is by thinking that we are totally free from our past. I guess it may seem intuitive. It may seem obvious that isn't true. But, the gambler who thinks that, the gambler who has gambled every single day for 30 years, and then who after 30 years one day wakes up, or every day wakes up and says, today I am free. Today I will author my life. And then, they feel the push to gamble, and they understand that to be independent of their history. Perhaps they interpret that to have come just organically, to have arisen from somewhere. But that is believing that you are not somehow powerfully influenced by your history. You are also behaving in bad faith. And I guess here is an allusion to the way in which existential philosophy is kind of problematic, because it isn't psychology. The existential philosophers, I guess some of them, maybe they kind of, had dabbled with psychoanalysis, but they weren't, it doesn't sound like, at least from what I've read, existential philosophy has much of a basis in empirically tested science. So I guess that's one criticism of existentialism. But obviously that definitely is not even close to being a compelling reason for why we should cast it aside as a waste of our time. Okay, so I guess that third thing, bad faith, that is supposed to be one way in which we can think about our actual life and see how existentialism fits into it. So I guess the key concepts from that are: there is such thing as a facticity. There is a context within which we are born that we don't have control over, which will influence who we are, right? And then there is our freedom to act on certain things. And I've actually done a number of episodes on free will. You should go and listen to them. I think I presented a pretty biased... Anyway, I have this video. It's called Free Will in 7 Minutes. If you want an introduction to free will, start there. But I guess the point that I get to is... Actually, don't worry about that. But so we have this freedom, right? We have a freedom to act in a certain way, to pursue things that we want to pursue, to try and change our behavior. Now, the sense in which we may not be free, which is actually not what the existentialists believe. Some of the existentialists believe that we have a freedom that is so extreme that we can kind of, control our decision making and thoughts in each moment. I don't agree with that. But I guess the thing that I was going to say was, there is a kind of question mark about the psychological or existential origin of our decision making. Why am I even making this podcast right now, right? So I guess I should, if I am not to act in bad faith, I should realize that I have a particular facticity, right? I have a podcast. I have this platform. This is something I do. I didn't suddenly just have the drive to sit in front of a camera with a microphone and talk about this kind of stuff. Although it's something that I wanted to do, it didn't emerge from nowhere. It came from my facticity. And so in that, I agree with that. So I'm not in bad faith. We shouldn't say that I am acting in bad faith in that sense. The second thing is, I'm not free from my past, right? Because presumably that influences my decision making. And the second thing is that I guess I haven't really thought about this today, but there isn't a fatalism in me making this video or making this podcast. I didn't think that I had to. I didn't think that because I had done this in the past, I had to do it again. So I guess that space in between is where we have freedom. In deciding whether or not we want to continue acting on the kind of pushes we get from our facticity, and in deciding whether or not we want to conform to the image of us that our facticity is pushing us towards. Because I guess it is. I receive a lot of information from my parents about the kind of person I should be. Unfortunately, I feel like they did a very good job of allowing me to have space to determine the kind of person that I wanted to be. But, I didn't do that in the context of me believing that I was totally free from their influence. Okay, there were 6 points on this page, but I guess in the first 3, especially in number 2, I think I covered pretty much everything. So yeah, I think hopefully I have provided a kind of comprehensive overview of some of kind of, you know, the basic questions of existentialism. And obviously they're not very basic, are they? They're pretty damn complex. And yeah, you shouldn't think that existentialism is a waste of time, because if you have been, if you are being, if you are someone who is, you are constantly balancing and evaluating and measuring and configuring and analyzing what it means for you to be. Cool. Okay, well, if you enjoyed the video or the podcast, please subscribe on YouTube, like the video, leave me a review on Apple Podcasts, support me on Patreon, or just tell a friend. You can also reach out to me. I'm on Instagram at ALEKS LISTENS. Send me a message. Otherwise, yeah, be, right? Just be and be free. Anyway, until next time. Bye.